All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming here and joining us today. I'm really excited for this event. By way of introduction, my name is Madhur Sethi, the Director of Technology Operations Division at TransPerfect. So to just give you an idea, TransPerfect is one of the largest multinational language services and content solutions provider in the world, and we were established about over 30 years ago. So who are we, right? Like we are one of the tech divisions that was started within TransPerfect about 10 years ago now in our New York offices, and now we've also expanded worldwide with being in Barcelona as one of our bigger tech hubs as well. So while our team has grown over the course of the 10 years, I still like to think of ourselves as a small startup within a large setup within TransPerfect. So at TransPerfect, we've always believed in developing our tech in-house. Our team has been focused on delivering technology and services that have simplified the lives of our clients and our colleagues. So the solutions range from platforms that bring about internal efficiencies to core services that form the basis of our global link platform, which Artem and Dídac will be talking to you about today, as well as complex client interfaces that allow our novice users to navigate through complex ecosystems. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Artem and Dídac.
Well, thank you. So Dídac and I are currently based out of New York, so we're naturally very loud. If this strategy of mine fails, let us know. I feel as though if I use that mic with just how loud we generally get, we'll blow everyone's eardrums out.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. So before we generally start, a few casual warnings. I tend to talk fast. If I'm speaking very quickly, I apologize. It's a character flaw of mine. I can't really do much about that. Additionally, we like to go on side tangents. Once more, I apologize preemptively. And then lastly, before we actually do begin, just to poll the room, how many people here are developers? Show of hands. Cool. Everybody holding their hands up, put your hand down if you do not consider yourself a front-end developer or front-end in any way. Oh, okay. Well, I'll take what I can get. Why not? So for those of you who are not front-end developers or are not particularly developers, I hope you get something out of this. For those of you who are front-end developers and we don't intend to work with you, I hope you get something out of it. For those of you who are front-end developers and we do work with you, don't kill me. So, generally moving on, let's start this the correct way, the right way, the way we all should. Developers, developers, developers. Let's get nice and sweaty.
Yeah.
And I'm already there. So, who am I? Hi, I'm Artem. Nice to meet you. I'm a software development manager here at TransPerfect. I'm a software developer, according to my LinkedIn, at TransPerfect. I like sarcasm. Before this, I worked at Deloitte for about 3-ish years. Audit is a word I use liberally. The term audit is the answer. We'll figure out the question. Very much believe in that. Dídac?
And I'm Dídac, and I'm a software developer at TransPerfect. And before that, I used to be a translator. And Artem likes to say that brings me full circle.
So Dídac and I have worked on a wide variety of applications here at TransPerfect. I categorize them generally into 3 buckets. There's applications that are used directly by translators in their day-to-day jobs. There's applications that are translation adjacent, meaning they're used by the managers of translators to allow for their jobs to happen. And then there are applications that have nothing whatsoever to do with translation. Generally, the tech stack is Vue on the front end. They all use TypeScript. They all use Sass. If you want to hear the rest of this, please interview. I promise there's more. So generally, let's talk about this, right? So I'm going to give everyone a general heads up. We're going to show some code examples. Now, these code examples have been sanitized. You will not know who it is from. However, if you look at this and you go, hey, that's my code base, it's not that we can't be trusted with your data, it's that you can't be trusted with your code base. So with that, Dídac, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah. So if you think about front-end development, so when you think about front-end development and you think about what you're going to do, how you're going to do this front-end development, you usually what happens is you start designing your system, right? And you start with your system designs. If you're a software developer, you've been in a system designs interview, and they ask you how would you design Twitter? And you design a system that is perfect. It's there's no latency. There's this for the database. You're going to use this thing. Your backend is going to be written in that thing. And then you wonder what's our front end going to be like? And they say some React thing, or some Vue thing, or this is like an afterthought. It's whatever. It won't cause any problems. The system in the backend will be perfect, and then in the front end we'll use React and introduce 6 seconds of latency because we did something we're sure we're doing.
Right.
Also, another thing that we never think about is how we are software developers and we live in a city with great internet. We have great devices to access all our applications, great phones, great computers. Our internet is super fast. And we don't think about people who don't have those privileges. And how are they going to access our applications from devices that are maybe not as powerful or maybe not, not the greatest.
Right. Visual representation of this is the drop-off curve we usually see with users, right? You've finally deployed your application. It's gone live. Amazing. You have 1 million concurrent users. The next day, you have a couple thousand. And then you bring your app to somebody to audit it, me, and we take a look. Or the inverse. It does really well. Your company gets acquired. I'm going to be a millionaire. This is amazing, right? We're all going to have jobs. We're going to work in Google. And then you hear the dreaded words that everyone always says. We love the technology. We're not really interested in the talent. And what happens there, right? Usually, your company gets acquired and somebody has to audit your stuff, me, and we look through it. We generally give it a quick skim through, and we come up with several pain points that are common and wildly infuriating. So let's start here, right? For those of us who don't know, a brief rundown of what is LeetCode. LeetCode is a platform that aggregates algorithm questions or just coding questions. A lot of the times it'll separate it into, hey, you'll see this in a Facebook interview or Meta, you'll see this in a Meta interview. You'll see this in a Google interview. And a lot of people, when they are trying to get their dev jobs, they are grinding LeetCode with a vengeance. And then they get to us and they come in and they're like, man, I'm going to write my code in such a way where it's going to be the single most performant thing on earth. And we always ask the same question. How many users concurrently will run your instance of JavaScript code? Dídac?
It's one.
There's a few exceptions. There's server-side rendered code. We're not going to really talk about that. That gets handled differently. But for the most part, your JavaScript gets downloaded, unzipped, and run. So let's go over some LeetCode, right? According to LeetCode, whatever this does, it does it the best way. I would know. I took it from there. Anybody have any idea? Feel free to raise your hand. I don't need you to tell me. Anyone know? So here's my guess. I think it does one of these, right? Same thing, one line, right? Let's move on to this one. This one's a bit easier to guess. The function name tells you a bit more, but just by the code block. Anybody have any idea what's happening here? No. Again, it's a bit more complicated. This one uses 2 whole lines of JavaScript, right? A bit less performant, a lot easier to read. Next up, we have this, which admittedly, very complicated. If you ask me what it does, I have absolutely no idea. It does it very well, I'm sure. The most complicated of them all, 3 whole lines of JavaScript, friends. 3 lines. So generally, what did we learn here, right? Dídac, can you by chance tell me how we're able to deduce if code is more or less efficient in JavaScript relative to C++?
Intuitively, it's harder to know what code in JavaScript is going to be faster or not. You have to at least be acquainted with the tools that let you know how is JavaScript running in this engine, in this specific browser? How is it going to run in this other engine, in this other browser? You have to repeat that for all these different browsers. You cannot intuitively say, this is going to be faster just because it's an interpreted language. It's not it's not going to be intuitively, you're not going to intuitively know that.
Yeah. Additionally, as our fearless leader generally tells us, very often actually, on my server, I can always add more memory. Up here, not as easy. So when we program, let's try to program for other developers, right? Like it's really cool if your code runs olog end time. Most people don't quite know what that means. Like, let's not write garbage code, but let's have it run. Right? And on the topic of that, let's keep our code as simple as possible. Like, not bad. This isn't a blanket invite, like, let's write terrible code.
No.
But, like, let's have it be relatively simple. So, a good example is something like this. Right? Now, admittedly, this code is our fault, our bad. Somebody on our team wrote this once. We've refactored it out, I promise. Take my word for it.
I will say most of the examples are from our own team.
The Vue ones, definitely. So let's go through this line by line, right? We initiate something called key with an empty string. For those of you who don't know what this means, it's okay. I promise you it won't matter soon. Then we're going to get keys of something called categories. We're going to filter out category subject matter from there. Then we're going to reverse what we have left. Then we're going to iterate over each item. At this point here, the developer got lost and had to write a little comment to themselves because they're just so genuinely confused. Let's read it. If there are two conditions, one per operator, for a key, don't allow more of that type. I acknowledge this as a code-based aneurysm. I have no clue what's going on here. If conditions, filter, cond, categories cat, length is less than 2, key equals categories cat, return key. I don't blame anybody for doing one of these. I have no idea what I just said. But I do know that it does this. And this is a lot easier to read, and it's a lot less lines, and it's considerably easier to debug. And that generally brings us on to our take-home test. Now, I will admit, our take-home test used to be creating a Reddit list of r/all, which we can't do anymore. Thanks, Reddit. We really appreciate you paywalling your API. But for the most part, you know, we generally ask people give us a Reddit list container, give us Reddit list items, and this is generally the approach. And it's not bad. We don't hate it. It is what it is, you know, like someone picks their favorite framework, they go on, they give us the Reddit list container, Reddit list item, and it runs, it's fine, it's okay, it's great. But then we got this, right? And oh boy, there is no scrolling on this. I don't know what this is. I assume this is an artifact from Visual Studio, but this is all of it. It is great. I don't have to go file to file to figure out what's happening here. This is amazing. And this was our team's reaction when we saw this. We were like, oh my God, thank God. So then we thought to ourselves, how do we possibly make this better? The answer is this. All this can sit inside your index.html file. One file for all of it. One file to rule them all even. You know, and this is good. This is great. You know? That being said, if you get our take-home test and you give me this, I'll know where you got it from. I'll feel really impressed, and I'll give you another take-home test. It'll be wonderful. So for the record, this is what everyone looks like when they give me some giant Angular application. You know, and just to give an even more cartoonish example, sometimes we don't just get an Angular application, we get Angular applications with end-to-end testing, unit testing, a simulator for mobile and tablet, someone's favorite color picker, someone's favorite date picker, Materializer Bootstrap, which they never use, their 5 favorite fonts, which again they never use. And then on top of which, in there is Crashlytics, Analytics, and like the story just goes on and on, really.
And they are not using half or most of them. So they have installed a testing framework that they didn't use. Okay. They have installed Bootstrap that they didn't use, again, or they used for one class. And there's this, and it's why? Just straight up, why?
Yeah. So our general solution for a lot of us is let's use something called progressive enhancement. Dídac, take it away. What is progressive enhancement?
So as I understand it, the concept of progressive enhancement is there is no one-size-fits-all solution to front-end development. There is nothing that is going to be like, I'm going to have my template, I'm going to use that everywhere. The requirements for everything that you're building are going to be different. So you would, like, the approach that I think if you're using progressive enhancement, you should be taking is, I'm going to build like something for my requirements right now, and I'm going to use exactly what I need right now. And then you progressively add over time what you like, the things that you're going to need. Like an application like what we just explained, a Reddit list list of posts. Do you need React for that? Do you need Vue for that? Do you need Angular for that?
I mean,
At that point in time, when you started, do you need it? No. No. You're complicating your life if you actually add that. And the amount of work that you have to do if you add it at the beginning or if you add it a year from then when you need it, you actually need it, is going to be the same. So don't saddle your applications at the beginning with all these different things that you might not need. It's because removing them once they're already in is way harder than adding them as you need them.
Right. On topic of React though, right? How many people have heard their React developer friend be like, React's not a framework, it's a library, right? And then the same person builds their own bespoke framework they use for the rest of time. As a matter of fact, I have that friend. Let me tell you about that friend, right? Back when I used to work at the company I just mentioned previously, I'm not repeating it, there was a person who built their own bespoke framework on top of an already easy to use library. And every single project they had from the moment they were hired until they were no longer there, used their same framework and was forced to use their same framework. And they kept adding stuff to it. And they were like, oh, well, a decade from now, they'll need this. Let me add this other thing in there now. And so when they got fired, I inherited their projects. And the project manager at the time was like, how long would this take to add a new feature? It's relatively small, very easy to use. And I was like, oh, yeah, well, after I strip out their framework, let me get back to you. So let's not be the people who are building for the solutions we need a decade from now. In 2021, I remember there was a weird arms race to release like as many React-based frameworks as possible. And I bet most of you can't tell me all of them. There were so many. No one's going to care 5 years from now. Why a decade from now? So a small side tangent from that side tangent. Why are you lying to me with your comments? Right now let me tell you what I mean. Let's go through this, right? So return a fetch request. This is fine. We'll get back to this. Check if successful. If so, return the response transformed to JSON. Yeah. If it's successful, also transform to JSON. It's not transformed. We return it even if we're not successful. And sometimes we return nothing. Or return undefined, as Dídac likes to point out. We return undefined. It's not nothing. The zero is a value too. Or sometimes we return whatever this refresh tokens thing gives us back. So, good job. We have skipped the queue of comments being lies in the future to comments just straight up being lies now. Moving on from comments that lie, why does your documentation tell me nothing? Right? What's happening here? What is onChange method handler? On what change? What shape does name take and what shape should value be? That's a very serious question. I have no idea, right? Some stuff is happening. Oh, again, like small aneurysm, my bad. Let's move on to on-phone handler. This is not, I don't know what this does. This is obfuscated, which is a problem in and of itself, and the documentation doesn't tell me what it does. I don't know what value is supposed to look like. I don't know what it means by on-phone. Is the user on their phone? Am I on my phone? Is this only happening if we catch someone being on their phone? On-phone handler, what do you do? And then everyone's favorite info component. I mean, yeah, it's a component named info. I don't know what info, but it's a component. Totes named info. And lastly, moving on from your documentation shape telling me nothing, why does your code straight up just lie to me? Can we get into that? What does F do? Serious question. What does F do? Is F to log something? Does F format something? Does F append 2 middle finger emojis to whatever text is in there? Because F my head, I have no idea. And anybody who tells me they know what it does, you're a liar. It could change. It takes itself out of context. That's not a joke, but it works now. It takes itself out of context. I don't know what that does. So, pop quiz. Who could walk me through what this does? Right, we have our good friend base component, which tells me that this component is very based. Then we have R has single value, takes in a parameter named R and returns a Boolean. Okay, except it doesn't check if it has a single value. It checks if the array is a length of 1. It could be a length of 1 and have no data inside of itself. Then we have UC first method, which takes in a param called stir, and it returns a thing. you could figure out what this part does on your own. Like the name doesn't tell me what's happening here, and I'm not going to pretend like I know. Then we have get RL index. That's not the name of my mixtape, friends. That's the name of this function, get RL index, which takes in parameters, array, value, key, returns a thing, I guess. And then by the time you realize what's happening here, you'll also realize this isn't how we use find index, friends. And by the time you realize that, really, this is our only option left. Like, this is the code we've inherited. Good luck, you know? So what are some solutions, right? Give me meaningful and accurate documentation. Failing that, give me no documentation and just use TypeScript, for goodness sake.
Or good JavaScript.
Yeah, like, well-written JavaScript is self-documenting in and of itself. As anybody who has had to integrate another person's API or another company's API will tell you, bad documentation is so much worse than no documentation, for goodness sake. And on the topic of like well-written JavaScript, like let's stop being lazy, naming our variables. Give me names that mean something, that tell me what value they store in themselves. Like name our functions what they actually do. I'm so tired of on-change handler.
And now after this small side tangent / rant about
I need a moment to breathe, dang it.
I'm going to tell a room full of some front-end developers that they don't use enough CSS. So these are two examples I took from NPM, and you can see there are packages from NPM. They're called React Flexbox Grid, React Grid System. You can just make a search for React Grid, React Flex, whatever, and you'll find hundreds, if not thousands of packages. They have 30,000, 45,000, 46,000 downloads, so people are using them. I found there's many that are being used, even in production applications, and they do nothing. Like this gives you like components that are achievable with just some CSS and some HTML.
Oh, this gives you not nothing. This gives you 277 kilobytes, and this one is 92 kilobytes.
It's nice, yeah. So it's basically bloat for your application that you don't need. You don't need. This is another example. This is a view masonry wall. This is a very common thing to achieve with some package, something. This one, again, like it's Vue, so it's not as widely used as the React ones, but like it has 3,000 downloads. Someone's using it out there to create like a Etsy-like or something like masonry wall of this kind. And a very similar result can be achieved with those, 15, 16 lines of CSS. And with a little bit more effort that I'll leave up to you, you could achieve the same result. So again, this is just bloat. It's just unnecessary things that you're adding to your application that you maybe should think twice about before just going, I'll just install something from NPM. I'll just do that. This is a visual representation of what I just talked about. This is what happens, what ends up happening when you just keep installing packages and you think, oh, it's just one package. And then you run an audit of your application and what you're actually sending to your clients, and you see it's massive. You're suddenly sending 6 megabytes of JavaScript. You don't know where that came from. You look at one of these packages, it has 20 dependencies that it is installing. One of them is like some library that you don't even know what it does.
Oh, no. Let's name and shame. Who here uses Materialize? Who here uses older Bootstrap? Right? Materialize brings with it a fun animation library for a button click.
Yeah, older versions of Bootstrap will just saddle you with jQuery. Like that's what it comes with. So they just like, and then at some point, like you're married then to like that specific version of that masonry wall. You're married to that masonry wall using Vue 2.15, and then your version of your application cannot go beyond that version because then your masonry wall breaks.
That sounds very specific. Actually, no, does that sound very specific? That reminds me of when we tried to migrate away from Bootstrap, and it felt like that. I felt like that girl, okay? Because not only are you updating to the latest and greatest version of Bootstrap, all of a sudden it's using jQuery. So good luck figuring that out. And the version of TypeScript you have doesn't match the version of TypeScript it's using. Also, the version of SAS you're using is deprecated altogether, so you have to update that, but Bootstrap requires the older version. So here you are rebuilding your entire application over one NPM package.
Yeah.
Good job, friends.
Yeah, this is another example of something. This is a Vue example. It's using Vue, but like it's easy to understand that whoever wrote this, like basically they wanted to do a tooltip, and they used a bunch of Vue-specific APIs to achieve that. So they have a bunch of events they're tracking. They're doing some JavaScript to do something with those events. And then they're using these view-specific animation classes to create a transition with this view, again, specific transition. Now, all of this just could be done with some CSS. What happened there, the developer who wrote that didn't know about sibling selectors or next sibling selectors in CSS, thought that to target that next sibling for their tooltip, they had to write it in JavaScript, they had to use something in Vue, and you can see how this is, again, less lines of code, much easier to read if you know what like CSS is, and like what those selectors in CSS are, and just it honestly probably runs faster too.
It's also platform agnostic, right? If we stop using Vue tomorrow, we could take this. The other thing we have to rewrite in React or Angular or Svelte or my mom's favorite front-end framework.
And now I'm gonna tell, after talking about CSS, I'm gonna tell the front-end developers in this crowd that your HTML in general sucks. This is a fine example of HTML. This is what I would call a fine HTML. I would call this bootstrap-informed HTML. Like the HTML here that you see div. Like you keep, like there's a tree of HTML here that exists only because Bootstrap asks for those different HTML elements to be in certain positions so that you can create your rows, so that you can create your columns, so that you can do all of that. You could just do with maybe Flexbox, maybe Grid. With Grid, you didn't even need, you could just throw your different HTML elements inside and just position them with a grid. And this is so, like sometimes you see examples of it that are so ridiculous that then they end up hiding things that are not just, not a best practice, but entirely bad. Like this H4 before an H2. Like this H3 after an H4 and H2, H6, H4, H6, H4, H6, H4. They have numbers for a reason. They should go from 1 to 6. Always, that's non-negotiable. Okay, now this is my time to have a small rant. Maybe some of you are going to be, I don't agree with you with this, but when we see this and we see inline styles, I could see some of you like basically going like, oh, no, absolutely not. I'm never going to do this. And then we see this, and we're completely fine with it. For a mental, this is a Bootstrap example, and it is basically adding all these classes to add.
The Tailwind example didn't fit on here.
The Tailwind example was too big. But this, to me, as I understand it, this basically violates separating two concerns, styling and your templating. Like then every time you need to change your styles, you need to change your template. When you need to change your template, you need to think about your styles. It shouldn't really be that way. It sometimes might make it harder for QA to test your code if they are targeting any classes or any IDs or anything. If you keep just changing those at will, it might make it harder for them. There's like the one advantage they always sell you on is that given a large enough application, and we are talking about a big application, at some point, the amount of CSS styles that you're adding are there's only so much of them you can add. So it tapers off. At some point, you get a small advantage of the amount of bytes that you send to the user. But in terms of like when you're developing this, if I see this and first off, I don't know what this div is. Like if, for example, I was using a CSS class instead, and I called this card, I at least would look at this and I was like, well, this is supposed to be a card, which is what it's supposed to do, I think. This is where I took this example from. It's supposed to be a card. And another example, some of you, if you think this is too ridiculous, I assure you, we've seen this. This is a real example. This is a real example. This is someone who was tasked with creating a button. What do you do when you want to create a button and you're using React? You grab the first HTML element you can think of. And this person thought of a span. And then they were like, I'm going to add a click event to that. And then they kept thinking and thought, well, buttons need to have also like the enter key so you can press on the button. So they added a key press event. They kept going. They kept thinking about buttons. They also need to be disabled. So they added those disabled styles. They kept thinking, what happens when a button is disabled? The button is not clickable. So they kept adding more and more complexity to this thing when they could have just used a button. And again, this feels ridiculous. This feels like something that no one does. People do it. We've seen it again and again. The problem with not doing this straight up from the beginning is that even if you try to replicate, if you manage to somehow replicate, and like the entire functionality of a button, and we're talking accessibility, we're talking being able to tap through it, being able to focus it, being able to do all these things, it's still worse than just doing this. Like you don't know how many accessibility features you may have forgotten, how many built-in features of a button you might have just completely disregarded. You might have completely destroyed your website for like people using a screen reader. So just if HTML is giving you a built-in element that already, where people way smarter than us and way better at their jobs have already built something for us to use, just use it.
So just to put a nice little bow on this entire spiel, right? We are not generally React or Vue or Angular or Svelte or, again, my mom's favorite framework developers. We're front-end developers, first and foremost. Everything else is a layer of abstraction on top of what we do, right? It adds complexity to what is already there. We should focus on starting from the actual start, not the end. If you want to use React because your job at some point will require it, cool. But at least start by understanding front-end development at its core.
And yeah, Bootstrap and Materialize are not a substitute for good HTML and CSS. They are a complement for good HTML and CSS. They are a great tool for someone who has a great understanding of HTML and CSS. If you flip that, and someone who has a great understanding of Bootstrap and Materialize, but they don't really understand HTML and CSS, you start running into problems like what we saw. Like their knowledge is upside down.
Right. On top of which, let's audit our front-end applications constantly, right? These massive companies invest a lot of time, money, resources into giving us tools to profile what it is we make, right? Like get acquainted with Lighthouse. Like analyze the bundle that you've made. Make sure that you're not just coding in a silo for yourself, because fun fact, in the future, you're inevitably going to have to interact with this again, right? Like at some point, a year down the line, when you're like, oh, I'm done with that, they're going to come back and go, hey, can you make a small change? It's really fast. I know you could do it. And you want to reduce future use what the fucks per minute. Now, Dídac, what are what the fucks per minute?
What the fucks per minute is if you are doing code reviews and like the people outside that room just hear what the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck, like constantly,
right?
Like you can measure that, and that's the measure of like how good or bad your code is.
Yeah, that's not a metric just because we're New Yorkers and we're loud. That's a metric because it's just, oh, it's so much pain.
And this is what I like saying. Frontend is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in that order. You can have a website or a web app, whatever you want to call it, that is completely functional with just HTML. You can then make it shine and make it beautiful with CSS, and then you can use some JavaScript to make it really shine.
Just a sprinkle of JavaScript.
Just a sprinkle.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Any questions, comments, hate mail?
I wanted to point out, I like to use inline sometimes, but I mean, it's a special case, but when you're like fast prototyping, there is nothing bad. Like,
right, we're not saying there's anything wrong with ever using inline styles. Like it's there for a reason. We're saying that using something like Tailwind and using something like inline styles, pretty much the same.
I think one of the points we're trying to make is flip around the conception of like, why are you using React? Why are you using Tailwind? Why are you using Bootstrap? Sometimes it's a lot of times it's not because it's going to benefit your users. It's because it's going to benefit you.
Yeah.
Like your end users doesn't care if you're using React or Vue or Angular. They really don't care. But they care if your application takes 6 seconds to load.
and what I wanted to ask you, what would be the alternative to not having like those classes with a lot of
What do you mean?
classes? Div, for example, you had a div that it was like a lot of classes.
The divs with like all the nested stuff.
Yeah.
So I like when you like that is like, that example specifically is because when I see something like that, even if they're not using Bootstrap, it's because they've used Bootstrap so much that they have that has kind of ends up informing how they write HTML. Because Bootstrap requires you to have, like for example, if you want to set something in different rows, you have to have a div here with column, then row, then all these things. So even if you're not using Bootstrap, you're so used to that you end up kind of doing that, not realizing that you may not need to do that. You could just use like modern CSS, which is nothing like what CSS used to be, to just write like modern layouts.
Yeah.
Like you don't need Bootstrap to write a standard column layout in a website. You really don't. Yeah.
Or alternatively, do that and then write it into a class. For goodness sake.
Yeah.
Just write into something usable. If you want to start with your Bootstrap class or your Tailwind class or Materialize class, just to prototype something out, to lay it out, to see what it looks like. Just remember, like with test-driven development, right? You write a test, it fails. You write some code so that your test passes, and then you rewrite your code to make it better. And it's the same thing here. You know, you write some HTML and CSS, and it kind of looks the way you want it to, and then you make it better. Like, you're not supposed to just stop and be like, well, that's it, I'm done, who cares?
And on the
or you can, and then again, audit.
Yeah. There's a lot of it to being responsible to what you're doing and understanding why you're making the choices you're making. Like when many times we tell ourselves a big lie, which is like, oh, I'm just prototyping. I'm just going to add this because this is my prototype. And then 6 years later, you see still that code running, and you're like, what happened? This was just for the prototype. Well, other features, your thing was actually successful, so there was no time to just take that out. Like from the beginning, think about what you're doing and be responsible especially with JavaScript. JavaScript, I think, is the thing that will end up like bloating your application to like the weight of the sun.
Yeah. Anybody else? No? Woo, all right, thanks. What do we adjourn for pizza and or beer?
We can